Okay. This is an interview with Ray Moore on May 8th, 1987 as part of the Georgia Government Documentation Project. I always ask people first sort of something about their earliest political memories and earliest media memories and introduction into journalism. And maybe you could start about where you grew up and what are some of the earliest either political influences or journalistic influences that you recall.
Well, I'm not sure that it's germane to your project, but I grew up in North Carolina, in Elizabeth City.
Okay.
And my first political memory is going down to the Pasquotank County Courthouse with my grandfather, who was crippled. He hobbled along with a cane, but he was an avid political devotee. And we heard the returns coming in the 1932 election when FDR defeated Hoover, I think it was, in that go-round, and the thing was announced on radio in the county courthouse there. It was an exciting and thrilling time, and that certainly drew some interest in me as a 10-year-old boy at that particular time. And I was influenced by FDR as well. I thought well of him. My family, both mother and father, were Democrats. And so I grew up in that tradition and didn't rebel as some tend to do, but found it to be an exciting and lively pursuit.
Were either of them involved in politics in any kind of way, or?
No. No, my father was in the newspaper business, but
He wasn't.
mainly as a printer, not as a...
Had he been a traveling printer, or had he?
No, he was a linotype operator, and that was a good living back then, and today he would be out of work. Were he living, which he was not.
And did you come from a family of printers? Because I know that printers often go back generations and generations.
No, I didn't. He ventured into that in Mount Vernon, Ohio, which was his home, and gravitated in North Carolina when he was in the Marines in World War I. So I grew up around the print shop and did much better in the front end of the business than in the back end, where I was lost and incompetent.
Okay.
I got more ink on the floor and in the presses when I was the devil boy changing the
So you would
things
change
like
the
that.
type and so forth?
Oh yes, sure. Right.
What was the paper?
Well, it was the Elizabeth City Daily Advance in North Carolina, but the Orville, Ohio Courier Crescent, where I went to work out of high school.
Oh, okay. So you graduated from high school, and then.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't mind talking about me, Cliff, but I wonder whether or not that's very pertinent to your...
We're taking a kind of a biographical approach, and then we'll get into some of the issues and people that you've covered in this.
When I got out of high school at the age of 16, I didn't have enough money to go to college, and so I worked on this country newspaper where my father worked, and did all kinds of menial chores there and writing, and eventually edited the paper and went to Cleveland, Ohio to apply for a job at the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And the guy told me that he probably could hire me because by that time we were in a wartime mode, and he said, however, without a college education, when the war is over and the rest of the guys come back, you, without the college degree, would probably suffer in the promotion scheme of things. So he advised me to go get a college education. Well, instead I went into the Army and served 3 years during World War II, 42 to 45, and that got me the GI Bill, and that got me to Columbia University. I'd had some exposure in the Army to Georgia, by the way, Fort Benning and then to Augusta, and did some radio work with WRDW in Augusta.
Okay.
And that interested me in radio, and so Columbia had an arrangement whereby they would allow you to take courses at NBC in Rockefeller Center and get credit for the courses in the School of General Studies there. So I took a course in commentary from Caesar Searchinger, a gentleman of whom no one has ever heard except me, but he was a wartime commentator, and history major at Columbia, and got out of there in 3 years.
Studying with who in the history department?
Well,
Was
that's...
Hofstadter there? Richard Hofstadter?
No. Muzzy, of course, was a textbook that we used, and I don't remember Hofstadter. I remember Dr. East, who bugged the heck out of me because about Robert East. He taught a course by discussion period. He would take an adversarial relationship and instead of lecturing, would argue with us. And I thought that was a terrible waste of time, but I see that now as a wonderful method of teaching. We were to defend our positions, and he would, of course, deliberately take an adversarial, cantankerous position, and it forced us to sharpen our background of knowledge from which we could speak as well, and I have since come to respect that. H.C. Surratt is another one I remember, and he had written a book on Brooklyn city political history and the like. Those are the only two. Well, of course, I remember Muzzy. Trout was also in the school at the time, although I never took a course from either Trout or Muzzy. They were the ones who were the most prolific writers, but probably didn't teach much by that time. It may have been in the waning years. Have you heard of either of those guys?
Muzzy I've heard of.
Yeah, okay. Well, those guys were the giants in the institution at that time. Eisenhower was president during part of the time I was there. So I tell people occasionally that Eisenhower needed me to win the Battle of Europe, and then of course he needed me to set Columbia straight. So I acceded to his call.
Performed double duty.
Right.
Oh, going back before we get you out of Columbia, how did you happen to work at WRDW? What kind of work was that, and what kind of outfit was that?
Well, I was in the Special Services Division. It was in the headquarters of the 10th Army Division. And part of our job was to assist with the morale of the troops and the like, and somebody or other had an idea that we needed a morning program over a local station beamed at the troops. And so Ray Weinberg and I were the, if you'll excuse the expression, the two rays of sunshine in the morning from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. But that enabled us to skip the barracks duty and sleep in the office and eat breakfast in Augusta after the program, and we were route order guys, which is wonderful.
Was that what you were called, the two rays of sunshine?
Yes.
Okay.
It was just awful.
And what kind of a format was that?
Well, we joked around and gave a little news and played a little music and things like that. The news aimed at the troops and partly to the community about the troops.
Uh-huh.
So that's how we whiled away the hours. I guess it was about a year before we went overseas.
So this is before you went overseas. This is in 42.
Overseas, I was what I suppose might be called a poor man's war correspondent with the Public Relations Office overseas, and our job was to report whatever the 10th Army Division was doing. And as evidence to my perhaps inability and lack of skill, we were involved in the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne, which was surrounded by the Germans in the Bulge, and we were attached to the 101st Airborne. A third of our division was there. The whole 101st was there. And of course everyone remembers the 101st Airborne there, but nobody remembers the 10th Armored Division provided some of the armor for that. But so, nevertheless, so we were there, and I went into the Bastogne just after we had opened the pathway. I think it was the 4th Armored Division at Patton that opened it up from the south about 6 o'clock in the donut. And there was still fighting on either side of the road, and it was a very nervous time. But it was a very exciting time. And Our division was instrumental. Gene Patterson, by the way, was in that division. You
Is
know
that
Gene
right?
Patterson,
Sure,
former
sure,
editor
sure,
of the
sure,
Atlanta
sure.
Constitution. He was in the 90th Cavalry Reconnaissance
Okay.
Squadron there.
He wasn't doing public relations or...
Oh, no, he was in
correspondence.
the fighting boys. He wasn't as I, a chairborne commando, anything like that.
How did you, what moved you in that direction toward the public relations or toward the correspondence?
Well, I had writing experience, of course, on the newspaper, and that they needed a writer, and so I was it. That was a happy transition, I think, for me, and that was a good experience.
Now, going back to, I can't remember your mentor's name at NBC?
Yes, Caesar Searchinger. Yeah.
Searchinger.
Mhm.
Tell me about him and the classes that he would teach.
Well, it was only about one class a week, and only for one semester. We went by the semester system there. But we normally would write commentary and bring it to him for criticism. Then we had a chance to read it and have it recorded in NBC studios. And that was a good experience because we were being taught by a professional and we were being critiqued by a professional.
Was it radio news or was it?
It was radio commentary.
Commentary.
That's right, because that was his forte.
Were you involved in
I don't remember a
production
thing
end?
that I wrote or did. And the production was quite simple. I mean, he had a studio. We'd stand in front of a microphone and read it, and then he'd play it back and critique both the delivery. More than the delivery, he would critique the content of it because he was an historian himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he was interested not in a colorful, flowery presentation, but he wanted the facts and he wanted a logical argument presented in the course of a crisp, short delivery.
At that time, did you realize that you were going to go on into?
Well, I had hoped to have a career in radio. Television was in its embryonic stage at that time. I didn't necessarily aspire to television, but I hoped that I would get there eventually. So I had some leanings in that direction. Yeah.
Any particular role models at that time other than Mr. Searchinger?
Well, H.V. Kaltenborn was one of the interesting people that I brushed against. He came to the front when I was there, and our division was enmeshed in an action around Metz, France, and Patton's division had stalled there, and that's where we first saw action. And so Kaltenborn came there. He wanted to go to the front. He wanted to be there. And of course we went with him and saw what he saw and talked to the troops that he talked to. And then he came back to the broadcast studio, which was in Verdun. I don't know whether you are familiar with that, but that's
Sure.
World War I.
Yeah.
And they built the Maginot Line
Sure.
and these tremendous underground fortresses. And Voice of America, whatever we were broadcasting back home via, was entombed in the catacombs of Verdun. And so I saw his script and looked at it and I said, "God, this is like a 12-year-old could write. You know, simplistic words, simple declarative sentences, and where is the flowery language or the colorful phrases or anything like that?" But then I heard that rascal. I stood outside the glass and watched him deliver it, and man, the delivery and the magic that he brought to it was so exciting, and it was as though we were taken to the battlefront by that crisp, clear, electric delivery that he had. And I later, when I was exposed to the likes of Rudolph Flesch, who wrote The Art of Plain Talk and of Plain Writing for the Associated Press, came to appreciate the necessity for that clear, crisp, simple, declarative style that he had: subject, verb, object, and also the delivery, and that impressed me greatly. So he was an interesting. I didn't ever attempt to be or want to be an H.V. Colburn. I'm not that nature of the bombastic, electric deliverer. In fact, I wouldn't have made it in radio, probably on a long-term basis. When I got out of Columbia, I auditioned in New York City at numbers of stations there to get over my stage fright, not because I expected to have any offers, and indeed I didn't. One of the stations I went to was WOR, which was a mutual affiliate there. Were you from that area?
From New Jersey.
Okay, well, you know WOR, and of course it still comes down on the cable, but in any case, they auditioned anybody who walked in, and I later learned their technique was to audition them and catalog them and ship them out to affiliate stations who would contact them if they needed people. But anyhow, the guy who allowed me to read for him stopped me perhaps 45 seconds into the piece, and he said, Mr. Moore, he said, somebody has told you that a radio announcer has a deep voice, and he said, you're pushing it down there in that attempt. He said, come with me. And he took me up the hall to where Bud Collier, who was a morning a host for the game shows. And he said, what you need to realize is that in radio, in the home, you're competing with the water's running and the kids crying and the garbage is going in and out. And he said, you've got to have an electric voice that grabs them by the ear and forces your presence upon them. And he said, frankly, you don't have that. And he said, I just would advise you to try to find some other career. So I didn't take his advice. And anyhow, I eventually got a job at radio at WSB.
Your first job was with WSB?
No. I feel I'm wasting your time a little bit here, but I had some offers and accepted one in Johnson City, Tennessee, for a newspaper-owned radio station. And it was as just a DJ, occasionally reading news initially. I think it was $65 a week. It might have been $55 a week. That was in 1949. And so they had a retrenchment. No, by golly, I got it the other way around. This is what senility does for me. I came there as a news director. They had no news director. And I did news for them, the newscasting, but they had a retrenchment. And the place was losing money so badly, as little radio stations do, 1,000-watt daytime only. And so they asked me to stay if I would take a DJ shift. And I liked the town and liked the people, and so I elected to stay there and do that, plus rip and read the news. And I had a great time with that. Stayed there 2 years, and then I wrote a letter to Marcus Bartlett down here because I heard WSB radio there, and he hired me, and I worked for the radio a year, and then gravitated to television, and eventually began to do news and TV here. That was in 51 to WSB radio, 52 to TV, and hence into that business.
When you started on the radio side, what were your duties?
Just taking station breaks.
Okay, so you weren't...
And missing station breaks occasionally, by the way.
Right.
Sitting in the announce lounge and wondering, oh my God, I've blown it.
So your first job was to just say this is WSB?
Yeah. I did a weekend shift also in which I did the news. On Saturdays and Sundays, I did the newscasts. Wrote them and delivered them.
What kind of radio news was there at that time?
Well, we weren't doing too badly. Bartlett told me when I came there that he was impressed because I gave my present employer as a reference. And so he wanted me to do the same. He said, when you're ready to move up from here, he said, I would appreciate knowing about it, and if we think well of you, we'll help you. Because, and he mentioned specifically Doug Edwards, who had been at WSB Radio just a few short years before and had gravitated to CBS and WSB. And he had done that to him, and so that's fine. So the kind of news that we did, I usually went in early on Saturday and went through the wire service and the like, and we also had the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wire there. And that meant that any story that was filed from the police station or City Hall, from the bureaus there to the downtown office, we got duplicates on our wire, and so we rewrote that. And occasionally we made phone calls, not much. It was a one-man band, and it was about all we could do to write the news and get it on the air, and a very rudimentary kind of thing. With wire service, we had AP and UP, which was rare for a station. But
What was WSB owned by the Cox family?
yes, oh yes. So it was. It's always been a Cox affiliated station. From the beginning, WSB was Cox owned.
And so, and the other radio stations in town at that time were
GST was
GST,
the
of
first
course.
there, and the Georgia Tech station at that time.
the
And WQXI was pretty big in the market.
ATL, is that?
ATL was here at that time, that's right.
And it's WERD.
Yeah, WAGA had a radio station that was big. When I first came to Atlanta in 1951, I couldn't get a room at Biltmore, and I stayed at the Imperial. And I walked into the lobby down there, and the first person that I saw on the tube was Ben Gunn, who was doing news back then. And Dale Clark was on WAGA. These were both Channel 5. Paul Raymond was a sportscaster back then, and he's a general manager now. How long have you been in Atlanta, by the way?
14 years, but I know
you,
some things.
these names probably.
No, I know.
You know,
most of these names are.
And historian, right? Well, anyhow, those were the guys. And Freddie Miller. I don't know if you remember Freddie, but he was an institution at that time too. But those were the big radio stations, anyway.
Freddie Miller was TV.
Well, he was not news.
Okay.
He was just a game show host.
On
Kind of guy.
television.
He had an amateur show he was famous for. He was on radio and then gravitated to television in the early 50s, I'd say.
Okay.
Mid-50s.
Now in 52, when you moved over to the television side, first of all, what differences did that make from radio? So what differences were there on the TV side from radio at that point in TV?
Well, I was again in the announce booth doing station breaks and things like that, but I did commercials first. I think Byerly's fresh fruit flavored soft drinks was my big air break. And so I got to do those commercials. I wrote them. They were zany commercials. I think the forerunner of the crazy commercials.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun with them, and Horse Brown and the like. And then I guess it probably was weekend news there first also, as best I can remember. It's a little fuzzy, but at that time Don Heald was doing the news on radio in the morning at the Biltmore, and then driving out to what is that now, that little low building between WSB and WXIA. That was the studio for TV, and he was driving out there and doing the news at noon, and Jimmy Bridges was doing the 6 and 11 p.m. news. And that, at that time, was again, rip and read operation mainly. We had no camera people at all. And so what was done was we would have a service from the newspapers. Again, they would get the glossy still pictures from Associated Press, Wire Photo, and then they would paste them up in a cardboard frame. And when they talk about Eisenhower, you'd see a still picture, black and white, of Eisenhower on the screen, etc. And so that was the way the news. Occasionally, we got the pictures a day or 2 days late, so very little of a breaking nature was there. In addition to that, there was a newsreel service called Telenews, one word, Telenews. And I think that was a Hearst syndicate kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they came with that little can of newsreel a day late, usually. And so what you try to do, if the building collapsed in Connecticut as it did, they were still searching the rubble the next day, so you would use that as this is what it looked like yesterday, and today they're doing so-and-so. You try to update with that sort of thing. And that was something moving on the tiny screen, you know. It was like going to the old Al Kramer Theater in Elizabeth City and seeing the newsreels that ran for the whole week, and they were ancient stuff, and you try your best to update them. But that, and even then it was more of a one-man operation. One man would write and put together the news.
The announcer you're talking about.
Yeah, well, in the case Jimmy Bridges, he'd be in there, and I can't remember that he had any help at all, except if we'd wander up, you know, from the announce booth, and they would pitch in or something like that, and that was occasionally, but not.
And he would decide what shots to use.
Right, yes. He had a producer, but it was really a technical director more than anything else. And the technical director would say, well, we're going to shift from camera 1 to camera 2 here for the drop car, as we call them, or we're going to roll the film. We needed a 3-second roll cue, I guess, to get the projector up to speed and things like that. It was cut and paste. Boy, it was amateurish thing.
Well, some of the print media people have talked to me about how comparatively primitive, say, coverage of the state capitol was for print at that time, but it seems to be even more so, of course.
Oh, yes, it was terribly amateurish. Right. And we'd have 10-minute newscast, and a 5-minute weathercast, and a 15-minute national news. And that would mean when you took your 10 minutes and subtracted 2.5 minutes of commercial open and close, then you'd have, what are we saying, 7.5 minutes at max of news. And some of that was transition, so you didn't have that much to write or to tell about either. Hardly any local news at all. It was pitiful. Then we got a cameraman. First cameraman in Atlanta was at WSB, and that was Joe Fain. He was an ex-bus driver who had gone to camera school out in California because he wanted to make something more of himself. So Joe was it. And I can't remember exactly when, but it seems to me it was probably about 1954 or thereabouts, 54 or 55.
Okay.
But Joe was an institution, and Joe brought us news. Oh, excuse me, before that, Jimmy Bridges was able to use the Bell and Howell, which was the old standard war horse, even in World War II. It was a silent camera. And on rare occasions, he would go out and, you know, do something with it.
And develop it.
And have it developed at the studio. We didn't have a developer there at the studio either.
But somehow be able to get it maybe that day or...
That's right, yes, right. Would you like a drink or a cup of coffee
Sure.
or something like that? What would you like?
Coke would be fine.
Okay.
So when did you start to, well, you were saying that Jimmy Bridges had the one Bell and Howell machine, and that was something of a innovation, and then Joe Fain came on board.
Yes, and of course Joe brought us film, and we had a little handy-dandy film processor, kind of lap-size film processor, and he ran through 100 feet at a time. We couldn't shoot any more than 100 feet, and we couldn't process any more than 100 feet, but
It's a very small camera.
occasionally we'd do some exciting things. Later on, I remember taking it when there was a building collapse when they were building the present Georgia Power building, not the present, the one on Peachtree Street
Right,
near
sure.
the Merchandise
Yeah.
Mart. There was a collapse of a building that killed a workman, and it probably occurred somewhere soon after 10:30 or 10:45 in the morning, and I ran down and I used the bell and howl in that instance and got a picture of what was going on and brought it back to the studio, and we had a lab processor then though, and because he processed the 100 feet of film and we put it on the air unedited on the news at noon, which I was anchoring at the time, and that was very immediate. I mean, I had left the scene at between 11:15 and 11:30, and we had the stuff on the air about 12:10 or thereabouts, and I simply narrated it as we saw it unfold, because I had edited in the camera as I shot it. That was immediate news. Now we hook up the satellites, and we're anywhere. They can leave the station and be in a downtown location sending it back in 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. And the helicopter, of course, instantaneously, it's up in the air and immediately sending stuff down. It's incredibly immediate now. Yeah, we were really primitive back then.
But when was this episode? 50s or 60s, or when talking about the
That collapse.
particular one? Yeah.
I guess you would have to find out when the building was being built.
Okay.
Maybe
Maybe
I
early
can't remember,
60s
but
then.
I would think it would be late 50s or early 60s. I was news director from 1958 to 68, and I think that was sometime soon after I became news director.
Okay. Now, before that time, before 58, what was the news staff, and to what degree had the news staff expanded? You said it starts.
Well, I'll tell you one story about that. And when I became news director in 1958, we still had one cameraman to cover the city of Atlanta. And so I went to Mark Bartlett, the same man who hired me, who was by then he was program director when he hired me. He was then general manager. And I said, Mark, we have one cameraman to cover not just the city of Atlanta, but the whole state of Georgia. And I said, we really need another man. It was man that in those days. I mean, you wouldn't send a woman out to cover something like that. And so he pulled out the rating book and the sales book, and he said, Ray, he said, look, he said, we got an audience that's bigger than the other two stations combined, so we can't improve the ratings. And he pulled out the sales, the program sheet, and said, we're sold out in commercials. And he said, I wouldn't have any place to put any extra commercials if I could sell any. He said, so unless you can show me some way that we can gain more revenue from this or increase our audience, he said, I just can't go for it right now. However, shortly after that, WAGA woke up slightly and began to do a little more aggressive news coverage. And then we got our extra cameraman and another and another and another. So that's when the staff began to build.
How did
Competition was the key.
How did WAGE get off the ground on all this, and what prompted them to?
Well, I'm sorry, I've kicked over the stool here.
Right,
It's a little difficult for me to remember exactly what was going on in that shop at the time, but it's Dale Clark was the news director, and it seems to me that they moved Dale into the editorializing realm so that he was the editorial director, and they made Paul Shields the news director. And Paul was a live wire and moved out, and of course they were editorializing, which also was a competitive move on their part. They were the first to do daily editorials. we did the first editorial documentary in Atlanta, and that was a half-hour program that revolved around the school situation.
Okay.
And it was in 1959. We had orders, we anticipated orders from federal Judge Frank Hooper that he would desegregate the schools. And so we were prepared for that decision. And at that time, the governor was talking,
Vandiver, you're talking about.
well,
Or Griffin.
uh,
Vandiver was 58 to 62.
okay, it was Vandiver. And they were talking defiance, closing the public schools, going to private schools. There were private schools cropping up in kindergartens, in basements of houses. The HOPE organization, Help Out
Right.
Public Education, was countering that with proposals to save the public schools. And so we documented the efforts of the private school, basement, kindergarten / church schools, and showed the comparatively weak efforts. We leaned on HOPE to present the other side and did our public school thing in a documentary sense, trying to be as objective as we could for about 25 minutes. And then at the end of that, we tacked on an editorial. We said, okay, those are the facts, ma'am, and here is what we think about it. And I said something like, I did the editorial, and it was something to the effect that for years you counted WSB as a friend, and we have felt similarly toward our friends in the audience. And sometimes it's a duty of a friend to tell his other friends the truth, and to say some things that may not be well received. And what you need to hear is that you need your public schools, and we need to obey the law, and that the private school efforts are not healthy and are counterproductive. And I don't remember exactly how we said it, but that was the thrust of the editorial. And you must remember that it doesn't sound like a very bold and brave editorial, but in the tenor of those times, under those circumstances, we were the first business in Atlanta to stick our heads above the parapets and get shot at. I had to remove my phone number. I was listed in the directory. I had to move that. The Atlanta Gas Light Company was sponsoring the news at noon, and Miss Gussie Jones, bless her heart, was the advertising director, and she said if there were any more of these, that she would have to seriously consider removing the sponsorship of the Atlanta Gas Light Company from the news at noon. And there was considerable repercussion from that, but happily the schools were saved.
Yeah.
And there were subsequent editorials that were perhaps a little bolder than that, but we advocated obeying the law, keeping the school open.
I'm interested in pursuing a little bit more about both the content and the style of that editorial documentary. I guess first question would be, how was that decision made to do the program and to take that particular position?
I advocated it. I carried the suggestion to our management, and they bought it.
The management at that time being?
Marcus Bartlett, bless his heart. I don't mean to portray him as a villain, by the way. I don't mean to say that, because he was a wonderful man, is a wonderful man.
Yeah.
He's still alive, and just a great guy, and well-balanced, mature, and bold as well, because it was no mean step for us to take at that time.
You knew that Judge Cooper was going to come down.
Judge Hooper.
With the
Yeah.
federal court.
Yeah, everybody knew that, expected it.
After Little Rock and so forth.
Yeah, and there was no question about that he could do no other than to order the schools desegregated. So we prepared the program well in advance, and we were on the air, it is my recollection, within a week after the decision was announced.
This
That
was
is my
then
recollection.
before the
It was in 1959.
So before the Sibley Commission
Yes,
Okay.
and that was another thing we did. When the Sibley Commission began its hearings around the state, we dispatched, was it before or after? No? I think the Sibley Commission came after that.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it
Yeah.
did, because there was no raison d'etre
Right.
for that.
Right. That piece.
Yeah. The Sibley hearings were conducted in each of the 10 congressional districts, as I remember, and we were the only television station to assign somebody, i.e. Joe Fain, to cover those particular hearings. I covered some of them along with Joe, but he filmed them, sound film. We had a sound camera, an Oricon sound camera that had 200 feet of sound film, i.e. 5 minutes we could take consecutively. So we had him out and we edited those, rushed them back to the station, edited them and put them on the air, and we had a program, a half-hour program as a boil down and a digest of those particular hearings as well.
Yeah, I've seen some of that footage. It's
Yeah.
very compelling
It is, indeed.
footage.
Old Judge Sibley was a great guy.
Had you done any documentaries of this sort before this particular one, or had WSB?
Yes, I did the first documentary ever done in Atlanta in 1957. I remember that because I stayed up all night before my wedding editing the damn thing. We had a half-hour newscast at 11 o'clock, which usually had a 5-minute segment for interviews, and I took the camera into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and did a series of 5-minute pieces that were slotted in that interview segment. Curiously enough, you see the wheel has gone full circle. We do these series on TV in the 4 to 5 minute gulps,
Right.
and then we stick it together and make a half hour of it frequently. Well, that's exactly what I did in 1957. I hadn't intended to do it that way at the start, but I did 5 of them with interviewing prisoners. It was called The Road Back. How these guys, some of them were getting out, some of them had been in, and their stories interviewed behind bars, and what they did behind bars and all the rest of it. And the rehabilitative efforts, showing some of them out in work release programs and the like. And so after I'd done the 5 of them, I said, well, why don't I got a half-hour program here, why don't I? So I did, and we just patched them together and put them on the air, and that was the first documentary we ever did. The second one was the same pattern at Milledgeville State Hospital.
Is that after the Constitution?
That was just before the Constitution
Okay.
series that
How-
Jack Nelson did. Hey, you're pretty well up to date on this stuff. You've done a little bit of looking
A
into
little bit,
things
yeah.
like that, yeah.
So tell me about how did you get involved with the Milledgeville situation?
Well, I don't really know what interested me, first of all, or why I did, but that particular situation interested me. I really don't know why. I felt it was of interest, and I have a history of going from jail to jail and prison and mental
I saw
institution
the
and
plaque
nursing home
from
to
the-
nursing home,
I saw the
etc.
plaque from the
Yeah.
inmates. Yeah.
So I simply went. I can't remember what precipitated it, except
Was it a
perhaps I
tip-off?
thought it was a good story.
Tip off from the doctors, or
In truth, it was not an investigative report. Nelson did the hard-hitting
Yeah.
investigative report.
right?
I was interested in the human aspect of things, and I knew it was a horrible warehouse for prisoners. Prisoners, really, mental prisoners.
Yeah.
But I did not do an expose type. I did show the opening of it, as I recall it, was shock therapy, the electric shock treatment. Have you ever seen that?
Your program.
I've never seen the electric shock treatment anywhere. It's,
Footage
putting
of
the
it,
body
yeah.
on
Yeah.
the table and shocking it. the shock therapy kind of thing, and I did that as an opener for that thing. It was very dramatic film, the schizophrenics and the like, and I showed the barren, desolate, overcrowded conditions of the place.
12,000 people or something
Oh
like that.
yes, yes, it was a city within a city, and yet I was focusing again on the road back. It was another episode of the road back, rehabilitative, and there were some being, even out of that morass, being rehabilitated, and that was the accent that I had.
Knowledge. To your knowledge, was there any, did this report on Milledgeville have any influence on the Constitution's decision to send Nelson there? Or?
I can't say that for sure at all.
Pardon?
I can't say that for sure that it had any impact on Nelson. I don't know that it did.
Was there much?
I doubt it. I think Nelson had some complaints, which I did not have.
Nelson heard some complaints from people
Yeah,
within.
I think that was what precipitated his look into it.
From the doctors you're talking about? Or?
I don't know where he got it. It seemed, my recollection is that it was some people who had patient relatives there, and quite possibly from doctors, but it was, and staff. It was inside information, complaints that he had that I think triggered his investigation.
Okay, then in turn, say, once that series of articles in the Constitution came out, what would be WSB TV's response after that?
We covered the repercussions at state level, interviewed state officials and people who had been involved in it and followed up in that respect. It was really his story, and that happens very frequently. We were able to do some things in an investigative sense because I believe in investigative reporting, and we had the first investigative reporter in town, who was Don McClellan, who's still on the air. And we did some innovative, creative things in that respect. But in all too many cases, because of our limited staff, as well as limited skills, we followed up on what newspapers broke. Jack Nelson and John Pennington were 4-star, hard-nosed, damn good investigative reporters. Better than anybody we had.
John Pennington was on the Journal?
John Pennington was at Atlanta Journal.
Yeah.
Just a crackerjack.
Yeah.
He's the fella who went into Buford Rock Quarry Prison and wrote the series that's still etched on memory. He had found in one of the solitary confinement cells, "There is no God," scratched on the walls.
Man who had broken his leg rather than...
Yeah. You have done a lot of studying on this stuff.
Yeah.
You didn't come in here when? 1973? Yeah. Well, that is ancient history.
I've heard these tales.
Yes.
Did you have much contact with Nelson then? Or any of the people with
Yes, we
A.L.
had.
Riley or Nelson
Yeah,
John or any of
we all
those?
knew each other and congregated at various gatherings of the media and so forth. I had a tremendous respect for them, and I hope they shared some feeling toward me. I met Jack when he was with the Carter, covering the Carter administration with the LA Times. That was 1980 or thereabouts. I was up there on other jump.
Yeah.
We had some good reminiscences of the times, and in fact we had a program on Sundays that was presented by the Atlanta newspapers. They bought time, in fact bought time on their station to showcase their reporters in a half-hour program, as I recall it, and they would reprise these things that they were doing on that weekly summary.
Sort of a synopsis of the
Yeah,
review.
of what they had done to, it's kind of a promotion kind of thing. which Pat Lahat, who was their promotion director, I believe she was the producer of it. And Pennington would appear on that frequently, and so would Jack Nelson.
If I'm not mistaken, the Lahat family was an old printing family in Atlanta. There were Lahats that go way, way back.
Oh, is that right?
These figures, yeah.
Her maiden name was Noot, N-O-O-T.
Huh.
And I wasn't acquainted with her husband that I can remember. She was a character. Big, extroverted lady who was just a delight to be around. Just a colorful gal. Patricia Noot Lahat.
Well, now, what you described sounds like some sort of development during the 1950s where the news department to some degree has expanded. There is a cameraman.
Yes.
Gradually you're getting more live or that day footage into the studio. There is the beginning of these documentaries.
Yes, yes.
And the beginning of some sort of investigative reporting. All of
Right.
these are within the 1950s still, these sort of beginnings of...
Well, it was the 1960s before we did the investigative reporting gig.
Okay.
Early 1960s. But the documentaries began in '57, that's true.
Was that more or less your independent decision, or was that part and parcel of a similar kind of movement going on at other stations around the country, or to what degree was that independent or part of larger currents in the industry?
I'm sure that was sort of paralleling the development of the same thing elsewhere.
I think of Harvest of Shame was when 60 or 62
Yeah,
or something.
yeah. And that was network level, obviously. And Edward R. Morrow, you asked for he's the patron saint of a lot of that sort of thing. And the McCarthy hearings were
Yeah.
influential on us as well. But kind of the evolution, it was in the late 50s, I think, when we finally got our processing rig at the station and we could process our own film. And I hired the first black reporter. We had a number of firsts for this town. I hired the first black reporter, and that was an interesting search. We had the first film processing. We had the first editorial cartoonist in town, and that was something that began somewhere else that we copied after. There were other stations. There were 2 or 3 other stations in town. The one I remember is New Orleans, which had experimented with editorial cartoonists, and I liked the idea. Wanted us to continue our editorializing and wanting a different format than a guy sitting in front of the camera reading something. And this was the way TV ought to be. So I experimented with Baldy, who was the Atlanta Constitution cartoonist, and Baldy freelanced for us, and Baldy was able to do some kind of animation. He was able to figure things out that would do a little movement and the like, and he really was with it as far as the TV stuff was concerned. And I tried to hire Baldy. In fact, I tried to hire Bill Schiff at one time too, because I wanted some of the savvy and skill of the newspaper people, but they would not permit that. To have somebody come from the newspaper to TV was verboten. So I hired Bill from the Tampa Tribune. Tampa. I think it was the Tampa Tribune.
Yeah.
God, I can't. Does anybody else mention the editorial cartoonist, Bill?
Yeah. Well, we can...
Well, you can
We'll come
reconstruct
back.
that crime later, but
You
Bill,
hired him.
Bill was a tremendous artist. He was a better artist than Baldy was, but he could not get away from drawing the cartoon, and then he would bring movement to it by panning it. He was very creative. He had good cartoon sense and good imagery and a biting pen, but it always bothered me insofar as I wanted it to be animated, because I wanted to see movement and to do it a little different. But he did the standard box newspaper cartoon, and then you pan it and bring the movement that way. Well, anyhow, he has since retired, and nobody has rejuvenated. He operated for years, even after I left the station.
So your documentaries in the 50s were first the prison, the federal pen, then Milledgeville, and then the Hope, Save Our Schools kind of thing. You went around with the Sibley Commission.
Right.
Now, what do you...
Oh, one other thing, vis-a-vis desegregation we did. I went to New Orleans and did a documentary there on how it should not be done.
The schools.
The schools desegregated. It was a
1960.
fist. I can still remember some of the scenes that DSU had gotten, the kids charging the camera, shaking fists and so forth, and attacking blacks.
DSU?
WDSU TV is a New Orleans
Yeah.
TV station. It's the NBC affiliate.
Yeah.
We were NBC affiliates, and Bill Monroe, who subsequently was the host of Meet the Press, was the news director at that time.
Okay.
And then we went to Charlotte, where it was done properly, we thought. All this by way of getting ourselves prepared for the time when 4 students, there were more than 4 students,
10
there were
or
4
so.
schools, there were 10, I think, in 4 schools. took
Murphy, Northside, Grady,
Bass.
I think, was it Bass?
I think it was Bass, wasn't it?
One of George or Brown, one of those, I think,
Yeah.
I know Murphy and Northside.
Brown High,
Northside,
Murphy, Northside.
Neither
Well,
Bass or
not
Grady,
Bass,
I'm not
yeah.
sure which one it was.
I don't remember either.
Yeah.
But anyhow, we covered that too, by the way. We had a skillful deployment plan to be at all 4 schools. Herbert Jenkins, the chief of police, did a good job of walling off the hordes of news hounds that we were, and it was a great day. And we did a live report. I did it from our studios to the Today Show. I think John Chancellor was the host on the Today Show at that time when it occurred, and we told them what a great day it was in Atlanta, that no demonstrations and no violence had occurred, and we had peacefully desegregated the schools.
I remember Hartsfield had a big press room in City Hall that
Yes.
day.
I think Jenkins set that up, and it was an information center, which was a good idea, a rumor center, and any rumors that were taking place, people could call there and verify the truth instead of having things spread like wildfire around.
And by that time you had how many people doing news?
I haven't the vaguest idea. What I remember,
5 or...
Cliff, when I left in 1969,
All right.
January, it is my recollection that we had a news staff that was just above 30.
Okay.
I believe that, and that included cameramen, editors, receptionists,
The
the
whole-
whole schmear. It was a whole bit
Okay.
at that time.
Although it certainly had expanded from the 1 or 2
That's
or
right.
3,
Yes.
5
yeah.
years earlier.
And we made another significant step. It doesn't sound significant to you, but when I came there, news people were doing commercials, and we cut that out. No more commercials for news people. That was unprofessional. And Tom Brokaw remembered that when he went to NBC. I don't want to be accused of hyperbole here. But anyhow, the tradition carried over, let me put it that way, with Brokaw. When he went to NBC and he was offered the job of host of the Today Show, with the assumption that he would do as his predecessor had done, i.e. do a commercial or 2. And he said, no, I won't do any commercials. So they passed over him, and I believe they took you down. If
Tom Brokaw came out of here? What are you
Oh
saying?
yeah, I hired Tom Brokaw
Okay.
out of Omaha, Nebraska. He was a weekend news reporter out of Omaha, Nebraska. And I needed an anchor person, and he sent in a tape. And I looked at him, and where is this going to be printed or distributed, by the way? 'Cause
This will be kept in the archives at Georgia State.
Okay.
And also you'll be able to see a transcript if you want anything.
A transcript of all this?
Yeah.
God, somebody's going to have to type all this?
Apparently so.
Oh, I'm kidding me. Well, anyhow, I got this tape, and I put it on the tiny screen, and here is this beautiful guy, lovely voice, good news credentials, obviously a comer. And then I heard it. It's, I guess it's, you give it an R, or akin to that, but it's a glottal stop, maybe more exactly. It's in trouble with the L.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, no, it can't be. But it was. And so I listened further, and it was definitely there. It's still there, by the way. He's worked on it. It's not nearly as pronounced as it was. But I called 3 secretaries in, and I said, what do you think? And they said, oh, he's beautiful. Hire him. And I said, well, listen carefully. And they said, sounds great to us. I said, you don't hear anything? I said, no. I said, listen to his diction. Don't hear anything. They didn't hear it. And so I said, you're hired, man. So he came in with a cast on his leg. It was injured in a skiing accident. And did a grand job. He was just great. And both he and John Palmer, who is now with NBC as well, had offers to leave us for NBC before they left. They wanted to stay with us longer, and happily did. But John had done, a network. Tom had done a network feed, and I think it was Tom Pettit who was head of the Los Angeles bureau at the time. He called and said, hey, what about that guy? Is he for real? I said, yeah. He said, he's pretty good. He said, do you mind if I talk to him about a job? I said, go right ahead. I said, I'll hate to lose him, but he deserves a break, and he can handle your stuff. So Tom Brokaw said no to him that time, but as I told both him and John Palmer, I said, if they want you, they'll come after you. You've got enough stuff to go, and they eventually did. We lost, we had 5 people go to the network from WSB during my tenure. One was Tom Brokaw, John Palmer, Kenley Jones, Fred Briggs, and George Page. All of them went to the net. And eventually Dave Riggs, who is now the associate director of the NBC News Bureau here. But those 5 left for the network, and one of our promotion people had a clever ad for the broadcast magazine. And it said, dear NBC, we gave you Tom Brokaw stop, we gave you Fred Briggs stop, we gave you Kenny Jones stop, etc., etc., etc. Please stop. So we had our contributions to that crowd.
Bringing us a little bit farther up in time, how do you remember how the station covered the sit-ins in 60 and 61, and then again in 63, 64, more general and civil rights coverage? How would you characterize it? What did you do?
Well, I remember the first episodes were when black preachers like Dr. William Holmes Borders and others decided to board the buses and stand up front.
The so-called love
City
law,
buses.
love law, and
Okay.
liberation movement, or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know about that in the late 50s. Yeah.
And at that time, John M. Outler Jr. was the general manager of radio and TV, and I went to him and told him that I thought we ought to be covering this on film. And he said, never, never, ever. And I said, but this is a part of history and we've got to cover it. I said, it doesn't make sense. He said, you can report it, but you cannot picture it. It would be too inflammatory. And there was that hazard in that day in time.
Yeah.
Definitely. So he was not entirely without grounds. And I said, I said, we are a visual medium, Mr. Outler, and it does not do for us simply to be on camera reporting. We've got to show. We've got to be there. And he said, you damn well don't have to be there. He was of the Harry Truman school, and he had many expletives, most of which I will delete. And he gave me orders in no uncertain terms that we were not to cover it visually. And so we didn't. And in fact, he gave orders to Marcus Bartlett that I was never to come to his office again because we had gotten a little bit heated about it. And I was, I guess in effect jumping the traces because Bartlett was my normal chain of command. And yet the instruction and the order had come from Mr. Outler. And so we didn't cover it. And I really don't know what changed that policy, but it soon changed. And I think perhaps it was the national import of those things. And I remember the hairiest time that we ever had was the coverage of the desegregation of the University of Georgia. I'm not certain of the year, wasn't it 1960? When Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes.
60 or 61, yeah.
I think it was 60, but it may have been 61. It's one of those 2 years. But whenever that happened, there were 2 nights of disturbances, and on the first night, Dick Goss went up. He was one of our reporter camera people, and he carried a Bell and Howell camera, and he was on the lawn in front of Myers Hall, where Charlene Hunter was staying. Hamilton was off campus, and therefore there were no demonstrations around him, but Charlene was in Myers Hall, as I remember. And on the lawn in front, he had someone come up to him and swat at him and knock his camera from his hands and run off with it. So we lost a rather expensive Bell and Howell camera. It was expensive to us, and I had to account for the budget. And so Dick came back a little shell-shocked. And so Joe Fain and I decided we'd go up the next night, and it was a hairy night. We knew it was going to be hairy because it was a Tech Georgia basketball game. And we had all kinds of reports in advance that all hell was going to break loose and they were going to really get Charlene that night. And we called the governor's office and alerted them to the word that we had of trouble brewing. And we still went to cover it. And I carried the old big Oricon sound camera with a 400-foot reel on it. We had graduated to a 400-foot reel then. It was a big, heavy, cumbersome thing. And I carried that into the Tech Georgia basketball game and got threats and little trinkets thrown on me. You know, we better not see you out there after we're going to get you in that camera too. And so we nevertheless, using no discretion whatsoever, showed up. And it was a scary night. The crowd converged after the game, many outsiders, as we learned later, I remember the fire trucks coming and the drum beat of rocks off the sides of the fire trucks, and the firemen were stoned, and they had their hats. I caught a rock in my chest, then at the height of the disturbance, and by the way, I still fault the governor and Peter Gear and others for not bringing the state patrol in to take care of that disturbance, but they didn't for some peculiar reason. They kept them outside, and I'll never quite understand why, because of course Governor Vandiver, whom I like and enjoy his company now, but at that time he had, uttered a no, not one pledge and give to somebody, yeah.
Put him between the rock and the hard
Yeah,
place.
but anyhow, no state patrol, and the crowd then surged across Baxter Street onto the grounds where the news people were converged and the like, and the first thing I knew, I was surrounded by a mob of people who were chanting, "Get that camera, get that camera." And they were coming closer and closer, and I was hemmed in. I was alone. Suddenly there was nobody there other than me and the hoodlums. And then 4 or 5 journalism students from the University of Georgia suddenly interposed themselves between me and the crowd. One of the rescuers was John Furman, who now is a vice president for Cox Broadcasting. He's a lawyer, got his law degree now, and he's sitting out there on the perimeter with Cox, and just a very nice young man. But he was a student at that time, and they were saying to these guys, now take it easy, he's not a bad guy, don't get yourself upset, watch out. But I was sure I was going to get mobbed, and about that time, before they could get me, the tear gas went off. The Athens police had let go of the tear gas because they saw things were out of hand by that time, and the crowd was surging on us, and we're probably about to invade the dormitory. The tear gas gave us a chance to vote for it, so we retired without honor or dignity into Myers Hall lobby, and I don't remember whether the state patrol ever got there or not, but that was the end of the hairy night. Joe Fain, bless his heart, was able to sneak around with a big coat on and had his bell and howl tucked underneath his arm, whereas those of us who had sound gear were exposed completely. So it was a night when we didn't shoot much film, quite frankly. So there isn't much of a record of that from a visual standpoint. But that was one of the tough times.
Now, a lot has been written, of course, about both how the media, especially TV, the media became an actor or an element in the civil rights movement for a variety of reasons at that time.
Yes.
From a variety of perspectives, and clearly you became a target.
Yes. Cliff, we're going to go on forever here now if we go into all my reminiscences about this thing, because
we could cut this session after maybe another 10, 15 minutes.
I have some observations about that aspect of things. It troubled me as well. It troubled others in the media also. And I had learned of the experience in Chicago where the media had, in effect, gotten together. They have a city news bureau there in Chicago, and I think they had precipitated an agreement among the news people. Incidentally, Kenley Jones, who is now a reporter for NBC still, was a product of that environment there. But anyhow, they had come up with an agreement to withhold the news of violence until it had been controlled, to prevent people from outside converging on the scene. And we had an informal organization of media people in Atlanta at that time, and I was chairman of the group and brought before them a proposition for us to do the same thing. And we talked about it at great length and decided that it was a disservice not to report it. And our rationale was based in part upon our experiences. I think the first riot occurred at Summer Hill, near where the present stadium is, and Ivan Allen got rocked off a police car, and the second riot was at Georgia Baptist at Boulevard. And in that particular confrontation, Jim Giltmeyer, who was our assignment editor, was walking down the street, and Jim had two blacks pass him, and they got behind him, and he paid no more attention to them, and suddenly he was hit in the back of the head with a heavy instrument. I think it was a rock, but we're never sure even now, but it fractured his skull, and I'm told that if it had been a hairline deeper, he would have been permanently brain damaged. As it happened, he was still laid up in the hospital for several days, and it was a near-death kind of incident, which was a part of that. And so, based on our experiences there, we rationalized that what if nurses had been on their way to the hospital duty at night, taking the night shift, and they were not aware that things had gotten completely out of hand in that area, and they stumbled unawares into that particular thicket. They would have been in dire peril. And so we felt that it should be reported calmly, dispassionately, without exaggeration, and as accurately as possible. And that was our decision. We were not sensationalized, and we were not overly excite, but that we would tell the people when a disturbance was going on in a particular section of town. Dixie Hills, I think, followed there, and that was a real turning point in demonstrations because Stokely Carmichael had blown the bugle there, and the followers had not responded. His leadership went downhill from there, and that was a tide water mark, I think, in race relations in Atlanta, when he called for the riot and it didn't occur. Rap Brown, I think, was a part of that assembly as well. But Stokely was the one who had primarily been the apostle of insurrection on that occasion.
And was involved in Summer Hill, I know.
Yes, yes, yes.
Why do you think that you, as the person with the sound gear and so forth, became such a target, or that the media more generally became such a target from whomever during the time, whether it was the white students at the University of Georgia, black residents of Buttermilk Bottoms, or whomever?
Well, we were, it's the cliche, the messenger, the Greek messenger was killed because he brings the bad news. I think there was obvious anger and hatred on the part of the whites because they felt we were giving Martin Luther King too much time, too much exposure, and that we were giving the blacks a forum to vent their displeasure, and that was simply stirring it up, inflaming. As far as the blacks were concerned, anybody who was white and in that neighborhood was a fair target for them in their displeasure.
On that day.
So, yeah, there was no question about that. I did the Huntley Brinkley reports from 1958 to over 5 years, 63, I guess. And I reported many of these things for the network. They didn't have a news bureau here, so I was their news bureau in effect. And I remember getting mail from George Lincoln Rockwell with a swastika on the postcard threatening death to me and others who would report this kind of news to them. they didn't want to hear this sort of thing. And as I told you, I had to take my phone because my wife was catching the angry calls. I'd get my share of them at the station, and I'd have a nasty letter file that I saved from there. But we continued to editorialize aggressively in support of fairness, and I have a file of a number of editorials that we did, commentary of this sort. In fact, I had one that I didn't give on a blueprint for trouble, telling ways in which a community could invite problems. And the way you invite it is you insist that everything is fine in your community, nobody is being discriminated against, all is well, it's just a few unhappy blacks who are causing all this trouble. And then when the rioting starts, you blame it on outside agitators, etc.
Right. And
then a blueprint on avoiding trouble.
Why didn't you air that particular one?
I don't know why. It was based on the Tolliver episode of Crawfordville in Tolliver County.
Yeah.
It's Taliaferro,
Yeah.
but pronounced Tolliver.
Oh,
And it's my recollection that the management counseled against it, and they thought it would be more inflammatory because I was pointing toward that episode. It was perhaps too fresh in mind, and they preferred that I didn't do that. So I didn't.
How did you arrive at your own conclusions? What sort of led you to take these particular stands, which might not have been the most popular, or might have drawn fire from different quarters or whatever? What led you to take these types of positions editorially?
Well, I think Martin Luther King touched all of us with the unfairness of the situation, and I'm a product of the southern environment. I grew up in Elizabeth City, and when I was 13 I moved to Ohio and went to school in New York. So I had a sampling of both sides, but I have seen prejudice at both ends, which is equally reprehensible. When I moved to Ohio at the age of 13, went into a bowling alley, the first sign I saw was bowling 20 cents a line for colored patrons, $100 a line in advance. The man who put that sign there, Wiley Williman, eventually became mayor of the little town. After that, he was thrown out of office, and he went to the edge of the small black community in town and had to make his living in a little grocery store serving the black community. And if that wasn't poetic justice and irony, I never saw any. So anyhow, I remember in New York City, of course, it was a desegregated society, and you rode the buses wherever. And I sat on a bus in Atlanta the first week or 2 weeks I was here, and I sat down beside a black person about midway of the bus.
Right.
When the black person got up and moved across me to the back of the bus, and I was embarrassed by that. But I didn't have the courage to do anything about it at the time. So I guess there were a few of us. We gradually got a little courage.
Sure. And let me ask, what kind of effect do you think that these editorials had in the community in terms of creating perhaps a different atmosphere or contributing to a different understanding of things and so forth?
I think they were a help. It's hard to say. I think there were others. People respond if they have a rallying point, and if you give them something to follow, that's not exactly the right term that I'm looking for. If you give them a rationale, and if you appeal to their common sense and sense of justice, I think it matters. It was a great service to the community to have the Sibley Commission hearings, and we did a service by covering them. The newspapers did likewise, and we had the great voice of Ralph McGill writing about these things. And you see, he was an inspiration to me. I remember still one of the editorials he wrote. It was based on the poem by William Blake, Tiger, tiger, burning bright deep in the forest of the night, what fearful hand or I dare frame thy fearful symmetry, or something like that. But that was the title, Tiger, tiger, burning bright. And he was writing about a Klan parade that he had seen. And the people in their white robes, the adults had a child in white robes marching alongside them. And his question was, what fearful images are being painted on the mind screen of this child? What anxieties are we painting on the child as it relates to his being in a world where there are creatures of a different color or whatever else? And that was a Pulitzer Prize winning column, even more so than the Jewish temple bombing that he won the Pulitzer for.
You probably had your own children at that time, and probably made it even more.
Quite probable.
I've asked this of other people in the print media as well as broadcast media. So looking back on how you both covered and interpreted the civil rights movement, so what are your observations or evaluations of how that was done in hindsight? You know, as we've seen the movement evolve, as we've seen American society change and so forth, and as we've seen the media change.
Yeah. I think we did a pretty damn good job given the tools that we had. And you know, the thing that I have often reflected upon is that we were an escape valve. We were a part of a bloodless revolution. Discrimination and suppression such as was practiced here could easily have erupted into much more violence than it did had it not been particularly for the TV media, I think. Medium? Yes.
TV.
And it gave the black a voice. It gave him reason to cry out, and it gave him a forum on which to state his grievances and to be heard by silent whites who sat in their living rooms and either got mad as hell or else said, you know, maybe there is something to that. Maybe we have been unfair. Maybe something ought to be done about that. And so I think we were a healthy agency in that respect in particular. And I think that we did a conscientious job, and I think we did, for the most part, an objective job. We tried to give voice to both sides. I think that whites would tell you that we didn't adequately, that the Klan mentality would probably feel we didn't adequately represent them, but we did give them voice. We did hear from them. We covered the Klan rallies. James Venable got his time in the sun. Absolutely.
How would you respond to criticisms from any side at that point? You know, I'm sure you got a wide range of response from a wide range of positions. And as news director,
what would be your response?
I'd like to send you or share with you a piece that I did on Martin Luther King's funeral day. And it's not fair for me to try to reconstruct it now, but the basis was that the phone calls had been pouring into our newsroom the night before, like, "Baby, you're going to burn." This is from the blacks. We pick up the phone, you know, "Baby, you're going to burn. You like so-and-so," you know, they were mad as hell. And the white folks, on the other hand, were saying, "Well, you've given Martin Luther King as much coverage as Jesus Christ, and you have deified him, and you have put him all over the airwaves." And I said, and they accused us of overblowing his importance. And I said, in effect, when you look at the people who were gathered in Ebenezer Baptist Church, and you see the important people who were there, when you see all the rank and file as well, and that they could march in peace, arm in arm, through the streets, that's my answer to how important that man was.
So that's pretty,
I said it a little better on the air.
Well,
with my written piece.
if we do a follow-up,
that's the gist
I might
of it.
very well want to go back and look at some of those. Would those be on file at the station?
I haven't. I took them
So
with
I'd
me.
like to see that.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I know my mother remembered very vividly seeing on television the New Orleans school desegregation and how it really galvanized her in a certain kind of way.
Was she in New Orleans?
No, she was in New Jersey at the
Even
time.
even there, she
Yeah,
was
it
impressed
sort
by
of really,
that.
you know, she sort of equated that and the election of Kennedy sort of all as a piece in that,
Yes.
right around that same
Oh,
year.
yes,
And I think after the McCarthy hearings, that was, you know, the next very vivid television
Yes.
for her.
Yes.
Just something that really, where
Right.
the medium really
Oh God, it was
conveyed
powerful.
it.
Powerful.
And of course, the original student sit-ins, all these kids got dressed up in ties and jackets and
Yes.
clearly with TV in mind.
Mhm. Oh yes, definitely. They played us like a fiddle. No question about it. Now, by the way, I might have the feeling that occasionally we respond with too great an alacrity. Hosea Williams, for example, is clearly a leader, but some of Hosea's news conferences are not warranted coverage now. I think we go too far on him. Forsyth County was thoroughly warranted, however. They asked for it, no question about that. And that has been known as a thicket of prejudice and hostility. And they had their comeuppance there, and Jose gave it to them, and he was again the old lion marching in the streets again, bellowing injustice.
Maybe you could give some other examples of how they played you like a fiddle. Talking 25 years ago.
Okay, let's see. Well, whenever they had the sit-ins, Lonnie King or somebody of that nature would give us a call and make sure we were there, and they knew enough to stage it at the right time so that we could shoot the film and get it back for processing on the nightly news. And they did the same thing with the networks, of course, as well. And it was inevitably good television, partly because of the reaction of the people who were told to mind the store, as it were, and to block the door to the cafeteria or the church or whatever. The First Baptist Church was one of those that turned them away. And that it was a mess. Well, I remember having a great debate in my own church, which was a Methodist church up the line, and they were the board was debating it. And as I remember the debate, we were trying not to make a scene because of the television cameras. And we were a little country church, even at that, Sardis Methodist. But the preacher said, well, I think that when they come to the door, the ushers ought to say, for what purpose are you coming here today? And if they say they're just here to make a point or stage a demonstration, we ought to turn them away. And I said, Jimmy, I said, I'd hate for anybody to meet me at the damn door and say to me, why are you coming today? You know, checking my motives for coming, because I said, a lot of the times the usher would have to throw me out right along with them. So we elected to let them in, you know. And I told them, I said, you'll be much better off if you simply let them in and make them feel welcome and let them sit there and enjoy the sermon. I said, we all might be a little better off.
Yeah.
So that was the policy that we adopted there.
At what point did, when you're saying that, really fairly early on, TV itself becomes a factor in all of it?
Certainly.
You know,
Yes.
when you plan a demonstration, what will appear, quote, newsworthy, and to what degree do you think that affected either the path of the movement or the nature of the media?
Well, as I've told you, I think it was a steam valve. And if they hadn't had that method of venting steam, there might have been a lot more frustration and hostility than there was already. Furthermore, if you look at the agent provocateur theory, that we were the reason for the big shows and the like, I did another piece one time in which I was doing a capsule of history, and I can't remember the exact words of it, but it was something like in 19 what I'm as a history major, I'm groping now for the Russian Revolution.
1917.
All right, 1917, when the Tsar issued a notice from his palace that the peasants were storming the place, and that Trotsky was taking over this, and the Bolsheviks were doing that, and the Tsar in a statement said, had it not been for the television cameras, this would not have occurred. And then the same thing in the French Revolution, a vignette out of that quotation, quoting, God, was it Louis the 14th? And Louis the 14th issuing the decree in that particular episode that had it not been for television, we wouldn't have had this uprising of the peasants. Exactly, yeah, well, you get the idea. And that's my thesis, i.e. that revolutions will occur and that injustices will out, and regardless of television is not there necessarily always as a provocator of the affair, but as a chronicler of history, as powerful as anything going. A lot of what we put on is pat and drivel and nonsensical surface coverage that embarrasses the hell out of me. But human drama, when it is unfolding before that camera, is as powerful as anything you'll see. The fire hoses on those folks in Alabama, that was just traumatic, and it had an impact beyond belief.
Did you all send people to Birmingham?
No, we did not.
Did you send
on that
people,
occasion?
Did WSB send people to any place outside of Atlanta, to Albany or
Well, I went to New Orleans, as I told you, and to Charlotte,
Right.
and I went. No, I didn't go to Nashville. I went to Nashville on the bus desegregation
Right.
thing, on the busing. I did a
Right.
feature that was ex post facto, but I went to Nashville to show the folly, in my view, of busing and getting kids up before dawn and trucking them all the way across town. I don't believe in that particular method. It does not desegregate in the first place, and it's an undue hardship on the children. They ought to be allowed to go wherever they want to, but not by orders of the government. I'm afraid I lost my track. I was trying to answer a question of yours.
About the movement.
Oh, where we went. Oh, that touches on another thesis of mine, and that is this, that in those days, we had so few people that I'm not sure that we covered our own bailiwick adequately and what was going on there. So the times when we went out of town were to cover Georgia stories. For example, Tom Brokaw went to Albany. Dave Riggs, who is now associate director of NBC, went to Albany and got thrown in jail, by the way, and we flew our lawyer down there to get him out of jail because he refused in order to get out of a restaurant and stop covering a desegregation attempt in Albany, Georgia. So we covered the state of Georgia, which was our bailiwick. Now, our reporters will be down, and you perhaps read the debate au courant about the business of local stations taking the place of networks and going wherever to cover. When we do a good job on our home turf, then, by God, we ought to send somebody away, like a Bill Nigut, to cover the presidential convention, campaigners, wherever they might be. But that's another part of the business. We were the fulcrum of the southeastern coverage as the network affiliate. When they rioted in Alabama and wanted to send news up to the network, they shipped it to New York, and I edited the stuff and voiced it on the Huntley Brinkley News by coaxial cable to New York, sometimes live on the air during the Huntley Brinkley News. Sometimes we sent it up as a pre-packaged thing, that is a 5:30 for airing during the 6 o'clock. But that was one of the methods that we did in the era of 1958 to 63. They sent us a good deal of footage. Or, for example, in other instances, Herb Kaplow would be covering over there in Birmingham, and he would fly to Atlanta, and we'd send it. He would do his package in our newsroom and edit it and send it off the coax up to there. So that's how we cover it as well.
I'm going to stop right